So, by this said, I'm very, very pleased to welcome this conference's first keynote speaker. It's Professor Leticia Merino, and she will give a talk on polycentricity and nestedness. So, please, welcome.
Thank you, Camila. I think perhaps I can stand here.
Yeah, you can do that. You just change errors, or if you
just to see the notes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to the IASC meeting. I happen to be the current president of the association, and let me tell you that in 2001, when I went to Zimbabwe to the 9th IASC conference to propose to hold the 10th Global IASC conference in Oaxaca, and my proposal was approved, I immediately called Lynn, who was not in that conference. She used to come to almost every conference, but she didn't go to Zimbabwe. And I told Lynn, my proposal to hold a meeting in Oaxaca. It's here. Oh, sorry. But you could hear me. I have a strong voice. So I telephoned her. Were the days where Skype was not very common, and I told, my proposal was approved. I'm very excited. And I think, talking out of experience, Lynn told me, well, Leticia, take care with what you wish, because it may come true. And here I am, 13 years later. I can tell you that these have been perhaps the most intense learning years of my life, and I'm also still very excited about knowing a little bit more about European Commons. I come from a very different and far away region of the world. I come from Mexico, Latin America, and particularly about Northern Commons. And I would like, before starting the talk, tell you that the IASC is a common on itself. It's a shared resource. It's valuable. It makes sense as long as people and members use our different products, attend conference like this, use our publications, our digital library, see the Commons in action, use what we are producing. It's almost everything is open access, online, and I hope you get interest, if you are not already familiar with the IASC, with what we do, and eventually consider becoming a member and come to our next global conference in Edmonton in May next year. So let me start. I was thinking a lot about what I could say here that was meaningful based on my experience. So I'm also social science working in forestry for the last 25, 30 years. But getting into account the increasing globalization taking place in economic, in ecological, and social terms. I want to start with this quote from De Brondisio Stroman-Jones, who says, "Connectivity increases the pace of disturbance processes such as financial crisis, but it also enables to foster collective action, collective knowledge and understanding at different levels." And I think this is one of the challenges, of the main challenges of associations like ours. Well, many of you know their story. More than 20 years ago, actually, Governing the Commons was published, if I am right, in 1991. Elinor Ostrom and colleagues challenged conventional wisdom, Harding's Tragedy of the Commons, and rational choice theories proposals, showing community members are able to govern their commons when they can communicate effectively on this issue. They have rights to make, make. I was very tired finishing this presentation. Their own rules, value the commons, share visions about them, and the ways they should be used and protected. They can cooperate when they trust each other and when they engage in accountable monitoring of the commons. This research was done, these conclusions were based in a large meta-analysis exercise that took more than 5 years, but it was based mostly in small and medium-sized commons. As a result of this meta-analysis, and I invite you to review Lynn's last book, written with Amy Potiti and Marco Jansen, that's called Working Together, that in a way tells the story about how her approach developed. As a result of these 5 years, 8 design principles for enduring community institutions were defined. These 8 principles perhaps are the best known and the less understood, the most frequently wrongly used parts of Lynn Ostrom's work. And in 2008, in the Cheltenham conference in the IFRI meeting, she decided to revise the principle and do meta-analysis of most recent case studies again. And the meta-analysis found out that the principles still worked very much with some modifications. As you know, they are defined boundaries, rules, appropriation and provision rules adapted to local conditions, participations of those affected by the rules in decision-making process related to rulemaking, effective monitoring, accountable monitoring to local appropriators, graduated sanctions to those who violate the rules, accessible mechanism, very often informal mechanism for conflict resolution, communities' rights for self-determination, and in the case, and it was only the principle number 8 that acknowledged nested commons or commons that were nested in larger systems. She stated that nested enterprises or nested levels of rules were necessary. Rules that were of different levels that were congruent among each other. But what happens in today's world? Many academics within and outside the association wonder if this approach is still valuable, is still applicable for today's commons, not only because we need to study global commons such as the climate relation system, the atmosphere, the ocean, and so on, but also because local commons or small commons where we used to start working 25, 30 years ago are more and more interrelated to global processes or regional processes and are embedded in process of other scales and are affected by them. So globalization, which in the short term or middle term will not be reversible, affects increasingly not only environmental resources, but economic and global systems. And they are interrelated and increasingly interrelated. Use and conditions of global commons generate positive but also negative externalities of almost impossible exclusion. In the last conference Lynn gave at my university, we had the privilege to have her visiting Mexico as part of her last travel. She gave a conference on climate change, and she defined it as a global bad because it was impossible to exclude. Anybody can escape from the consequence of it. I also find that systems and goods of different scales are densely interconnected, and decisions and practices of local systems have regional or global effects and vice versa. Decisions and practices for global commons have also local and regional impacts. And among the international community, whether academic or international agencies, there's or diplomatic services, there's a wide an increasingly wider recognition that the current international and national governance systems do not respond to the challenges created by global environmental change. I mean, the political, economic systems are not achieving mitigation goals, that's reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, and they are not either good enough to create the needed adaptation responses in different regions of the world. So we know that climate changing is happening. I mean, this is just a graphic I got. And we will talk about, or I will talk about climate because being in the north, it's very key, or we also, I mean, that might be an overgeneralization, but when we talk nowadays about the north, we talk about climate change, but climate change, it's happening everywhere. I just wanted to point out that climate change, and you know, because this scheme was developed here in this country by the Stockholm Resilience Center, that interconnected, it's very tight among different ecological processes, to the point that ecologists are talking more and more about the Anthropocene as a new geologic era, differentiated from previous geological eras, and climate change, it's one of the problems. I mean, here the scheme shows when the color is green that there's a problem, but it's not very grave. The problems painted in red, the sign stronger negative effects, and these borders, I mean, these planetary borders correspond to the thresholds. When you pass over one of these thresholds, the process is irreversible. So we have these different processes, not only climate change, and the fact is that these processes are very closely interrelated. Ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone depletion, altered cycles of minerals like phosphorus and nitrogen, freshwater bodies being increasingly deteriorated, land use change, erosion of biodiversity, and chemical pollution in water and soils. And I would like to note that some of these variables have not, it's not that they are not problematic, but we don't have enough data, we don't have, they haven't been quantified to assess how serious they are. But we will focus in climate. So we tend to think that effectively higher temperatures in the continents are stronger in the north. But in other parts of the world, I think problems as serious as you face here are the decrease of glaciers that affect the water bodies. And in the tropics, where I lived, I mean, I have worked on climate change and adaptation, mostly in Mexico and Central America. There's a marked alteration of hydrological cycles, frequent and extreme dry seasons, very long, and the same rainfall, the same quantity of rain, but concentrated in shorter periods of times with more and more intense extreme meteorological events. Well, we know that the climate's changing, that precipitation trends are changing. So what happens in institutional and socio-economic, socio-environmental terms? The systemic environmental change and planetary capacity to regulate ecological processes are complex, and much more complex than the type of goods we used to study 20 or 30 years ago, in the sense that they respond not to few variables, but multiple interrelated variables that work in different scales. So analysis is much more complex. And there's no linear relation between causes and effects processes. Processes take place in different regional scales and interact and influence each other. And as a result, uncertainty tends to become not the exception, but the rule. One of the not principles, but one of the conclusions of the first research of Ostrom, and I have been for years, part of the IFRI program, of the International Forest Resources and Institution program, we used to see that user groups need secure conditions in order to invest in sustainability, and now what we are facing are increasingly uncertain systems. And there's, the database that Lynn built in the late 80s was exploring successful and unsuccessful cases. But at the level of global commons, there's very scarce experience of successful cases. Perhaps only the ozone layer, but not others. So when Lynn came to Mexico, she posed these questions. The first one is the conventional theory of collective action, let's say rational choice theory, the best option for analyzing how to reduce the threats of massive climate and environmental change? Should we think that the tragedy of the commons is happening at this level, at global level, and there's no other option? Should we think that free riders are all over, or are the dominant kind of actors when we talk about, when it relates to global commons? Or can process of global environmental change be understood from the perspective of collective actions and commons theory? And what can we use from past local or regional focused research? Obviously, we cannot jump from the local and regional to the global levels as such. Other questions that Lynn posed was, are larger scale governments or large agencies better equipped to cope with collective action problems that have outcomes that are large scale themselves? Are treaties among government the only or the best way? Are government the best suited actors to face this program or to impose solutions? And her orientation, that was polycentricity, was if multiple governments of different levels and organizations, and she was talking here about civil societies, organization, municipalities, communities, instead of a unitary authority, work to reduce energy and greenhouse emissions, does that only produce leakage, chaotic systems, and potentially counterproductive processes, or can they be fruitful? And this leads to the question of what is most important. What should we privilege? Mitigation, that's reduction of emissions, that's global perspective of adaptation. Having worked for a number of years in El Salvador, I always tell that Central America is responsible of 0.09 of global emissions, while 95% of the land is considered as highly vulnerable in climatic terms by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So she was asking, are there only global benefits generated from local efforts to reduce greenhouse gases emission? This is to say, are the global actors predominantly free riders, or are there potential benefits at the same time for the locals produced at multiple scales? How to achieve this balance? And can actions taken at local and regional levels reduce greenhouse gas emission, or at least offer some levels of adaptation? These are very general theories. And I think a lot of work, theoretical and empirical, needs to be developed on global commons very quickly. She proposed, and I agree, that if commons theory has a potential for understanding and acting on global processes, this depends mostly on the use of multi-scale and ecosystemic perspective for the analysis of appropriation and provision problems of global commons, and for policies. I mean, we cannot focus, we cannot work on a single scale anymore. We need to work in analytical and policy terms, considering the effects of different scales on each other, and also considering the interrelation of different processes and an ecosystemic perspective. I think it's also needed a reformulation of the theory and methodology of the Commons School, reviewing the design principles and looking at how they are appropriate to understand global processes or what needs to be changed. Also, it needs to be reformulated, the role and trust and types of trust. We know that for Lynn and for the Commons School, trust has a key role in collective action and in overcoming collective action dilemmas. But which type of trust we can talk about when we don't have face-to-face relation, when we are talking and working on global commons? And also, information and knowledge need to be worked from a nested approach. So there's a big need. I mean, this analysis needs to feed institutional innovation, institutions linking multiple levels, fostering trust, cooperation, and conflict resolution in different scales, and they are still essential for long-term protection of commons, in this case global commons. And here it's an effort of developed by Ruth Mason-Dick and the Capri team, trying to relate scales, I mean spatial and time scale, in which different commons are placed, and the type of rights, that's a big generalization, the types of rights they require. I mean, Ostrom stated that security for property rights was important, but she was not talking only about individual private rights to sell or buy land. I mean, she was talking about a much more complex conception of property and rights. And here we see, I mean, the need of social collective action and state collective action. I mean, it's not like the states or markets do not have any role, but the role they have depends on the case and depends on the scale. So I know this is complicated, but I think it's a nice summary. And I would like to, I mean, going to an end, remind one of the late lessons learned or conclusions. I mean, Aruna Agrawal was telling that Lynn took about 20 years to develop from governing the commons to working together and an ontological conception, a conception of human beings. But first, I think one of the important points that she made with Jansen and Bottiti and others is the coupled nature of socio-ecological system. I mean, if there's a social problem, or a social process, I mean, it's very likely that it will reflect a way or another in the ecology and vice versa. So we need to be trained, we need to be reframed our way of thinking in terms of socio-ecological system analysis, and this is challenging. Going into Lynn's ontology, I mean, she pointed out that individuals use different rationalities in different contexts, that individuals were not merely rational maximizers, but were able to learn norms, were able to learn to cooperate, and many individuals have aversion to what they perceive as unfair or injustice, and that's very important. Under proper conditions, and I would underline proper conditions, they can cooperate and overcome social dilemmas. Social dilemmas are, in general terms, are the contradiction between individual interest and collective interest. And the third point, and for me it's very important, coming from a very centralized country where the states, even before the colonial times, the Tlatoanis in Mexico, decided everything from Mexico City. I mean, even they said even how a tree moves in the Yucatan Peninsula. Lynn, and this is based on her work with Juan Camilo Cárdenas, underlined the risk to overcrowd local or regional governance system when there's external overregulation. This is when there's overregulation imposed by central state, very, very foreign to local conditions. The big risk is open access. It's a destruction of local rules and no rules at all, because it's very expensive to accomplish the rules, and to accomplish rules that very often do not make sense in local realities. And at the end of her Nobel lecture, she underlined the importance of trust. I remember her telling trust. We have to learn to trust to resolve social dilemmas when it's possible. So at the local level, how does it translate? So we need, social capital. Social capital is fundamental to overcome collective social dilemmas at the local level and at all levels. I would make a commitment if I cannot trust the people with whom I'm committing, same at the local level, same between countries. Social capital at larger levels can be understood as the value of trust generated by social networks to facilitate group cooperation on shared interests and the organization of social institutions at different scales. This is easier said than done. And there have been, different schemes, institutional schemes have been experimented in the last years dealing with these larger commons. One of them is co-management. So in the context of co-management, management by different actors such as the state and local communities, or the state and private firms, the complex nature of cross-level resource systems require institutional arrangements that facilitate co-production, mediation, merge, translation, and negotiation of information and knowledge. And here again, accountability at larger levels, at national levels, at global levels, it's fundamental to maintain or create social capital. In a conference 2 years ago that I attended with Lynn called Planet Under Pressure in England, Richard Wilkinson, which is an epidemiologist, made a very interesting presentation on the impacts of inequality in different conditions. He relates, here we have a scheme of the different countries of the OCDE, ranked from the less unequal to the most unequal. The less unequal, you are very lucky, are the Scandinavian countries and Japan, coming from different policy trends. And the most unequal within the OCDE of these countries which have data. Mexico is part of the OECD, but there are no data about quality of life. But the most unequal is Singapore, the USA, Portugal, and the UK. And he was pointing out that the USA and the UK were not as unequal as they are today, that this is a result very much of the policies implemented by Thatcher and Reagan years ago. But nevertheless, he relates inequality with human well-being, with people in prison, with severity and sanctions, and so on. This is a very interesting book called The Spirit Level. But I wanted to show you that that's the impact of inequality on trust. If we want to govern the commons, local commons, or global commons, trust is fundamental. And inequality, that's of income. I mean, we can think in inequality in a variety of terms. Inequality has a pervasive impact on trust, on other goods, but on trust and governance. And this has been proved in the field in economic experiments carried on in Colombia and Mexico by Juan Camilo Cárdenas, who worked with Lee Nostrom in these economic experiments. So inequality, power gaps, elite capture are present when we talk about global goods, particularly in the developing world. And it is to say, I mean, talking about climate, that the distribution of GI emissions is profoundly unequal between countries. I was talking about Central America contribution to GI gases versus the level of vulnerability, but also within countries. I mean, it's not a question only of North versus South. I mean, most of the population, or a large population in the world, lives in condition of poverty of energy. I mean, they don't have enough energy to fulfill their basic needs. But this is also a problem within country. I mean, Mexico, it's the most, and there are no data, it's the most unequal country in Latin America. It's one of the third more unequal countries in the world, so you wonder. There's also unequal distribution of climatic vulnerability, including the capacities of adaptation. Obviously, the poorest people are those with less capacity to adapt. That's a huge field. And there's an unequal, distribution of the cost of climate policy. I mean, very often the climate policies, the costs, are carried by the poorest sectors, at least in the developing countries. In these countries, I mean, mistrust and elite capture, it's very much present, particularly in countries with colonial past and large history of authoritarian rule. So these are part of the challenges needed to overcome in order to make trustable policies. So I find that four fields of perception and knowledge need to be, that there's a need to promote common visions and shared knowledge in four fundamental themes related to global climate change and to global environmental change. One is the vision of landscape and territories that from global points of view and elite points of view are seen as hinterlands and merely carbon sinks, and locally they tend to be seen more as cultural commons and multi-use landscape with patrimonial value. So I think we need to transit from one vision to the other, taking into account or trying to build a common vision. Also, the prescription of ideal management and monitoring schemes. From global terms, and I'm thinking about RED program, or elite, national elites views, I mean, that prefer protected areas. There needs to be a transition from absolute prohibition as a base of conservation policy to a management that promotes different sustainable uses, ecosystemic values, searching carbon balance of the territories more than carbon sequestration itself. I mean, that means that low carbon agriculture and low carbon activities can be performed, taking into account that 3/3 of the terrestrial carbon is in the soils. Also, the views about people. I think from governmental and global point of view, very often people and local communities are seen as pressures that need to be taken away from precious ecosystems. I think this needs to change, moving to consider communities and local people as assets for conservation and resilience building, as environmental citizens. Finally, the big discussion on who owns the rights over ecosystems and carbon sinks. RED and global policies tend to focus on national governments as sole right holders of carbon sink. This needs to move to a more co-management and co-production perspective. And very briefly, the case of Mexico. Mexico, 73%. Mexico is a forested country. It's not an agricultural country. 73% of the country is covered with forests and mountains. More than 50% of rural communities have forests. 12 million people live in 30,000 communities. They are often very poor, even if they own these very rich resources, very productive forest resources. And legally, community forest areas have to be collectively owned and managed. I mean, private forest property is prohibited. And something about 2,000 communities have performed since 25 years ago experience of cooperatives that perform logging for commercial purposes. Many of them are certified since 20 years ago by the Forest Stewardship Council. Well, I'm ending this long talk with data of our research I did years ago in 102 communities. This is a representative sample of the temperate forest of the country. We made a lot of questions and we built different indexes. Here I'm working with the index of forest economic development. I mean, whether communities log, whether they have mills, whether they dry whether they are able to add value to the forest production. So we developed this index of economic forest activity and related it with another index that's pressures on forest areas. In order to build the index of pressures on forest areas, I considered fires, infections in the forest, illegal cutting, and land use change. And we found surprise, opposed to what most of the conservation agencies and in Mexico, governmental and non-governmental believe, and in Latin America, it's that the forest with more, the communities that get more business done with the forest, with more solid, which are few, local forest economies, are those where pressures on the forest are lower, not the opposite. And this was tested once and twice, and it's published recently in a book that will be translated soon. We also relate the index of economic development with another index, the index of protection and conservation activities. Here we consider the active conservation practices that people put in place. Whether they have locally protected area, and we found that 40% of our communities have locally protected areas. That I repeat once and once again to the National Commission on Conservation, who wants to implement protected areas all over. We find that communities who have a local economy based on forestry are those who have more protected areas and also have more monitoring that Lynn believed was critical for sustainability, monitoring of the state of the resource and monitoring of the way people behave. Whether they accomplish with a collective defined rules on forest management or not. They had teams that were fighting forests and pests. Whether they were able and had in practice measure to protect the forest. Here also the relation it's very strong. And finally, and perhaps this is what I like the most, this is an assembly of the kids of a secondary school in Oaxaca that's a workshop on how they envision their future and the future of the forest that we performed years ago, and here are the not so young people doing the same exercise. And we developed an index of social organization, I mean, taking into account the number of times that people meet, that communities have assembly, the types of decision they take, the level of participation, the level of sanctioning, the level in which community members want to take part in governance system, and governance systems are voluntary. I mean, they are not paid, and it can be, almost a full-time job, even worse than being president of the IASC. So we found that conservation and protection activities were very related with organizational strength. I mean, and I like to see that in numbers, because for years, like 15 years perhaps, I mean, when I worked for the IFRI program, I was doing, me and others, and we're doing one case study after the other, and we got in-depth understanding of one or two communities, but here we have like a general view of the forest of the country, and these correlations were for me very meaningful, and I think they apply at least for Central and South America. Well, this is public goods. That's my favorite town. I mean, I would like to be commoner there. Most of the gains of the forest enterprises are invested in local public goods, and not only clinics or schools, but also cultural goods. I mean, if you live there and you, as a youngster, there is a high school there, and you learn to play an instrument for a year, you can ask the assembly to buy you an instrument. And there are now like 5 music bands, and most of the musicians are girls. So it's really nice. I mean, and getting back to the global level, and carbon sequestration, and the need to maintain forests, and very often the idea that in order to improve carbon sequestration, forested areas shouldn't be touched. I mean, human presence is per se an enemy of forest conservation. This is a scheme I learned about some 2 years ago from the Canadian Forest Service, and it's not an accident that comes from Canada. They said, yes, I mean, if you perform logging, there will be voids in the carbon sequestration, but you have to take into account the carbon that's stored in the timber, like here. I mean, we should have more complete accounting of carbon sequestration. And the beautiful thing, talking about development and developing countries, is that the most value added you have, the most likely that the carbon will remain sequestered in the timber. I mean, I happen to have at home the piano of my grandparents. That's made in, what's the name of? I mean, very, very heavy. It weighs like 300 kilos. Very heavy timber. And it's 110 years ago. I'm not going to burn it as charcoal. I mean, so the carbon will remain sequestered there. So the message is value added, I mean, forestry with value added at small scale, I'm talking about small forests, can be a very viable mitigation and adaptation strategy. But then you need to build linkages among different scales. The challenges for this experiment of community forestry that has 25, 30 years, my whole professional life, is that still community forest production, because it's communitarian, it's performed by poor people, is regarded by city people and politicians as a threat to conservation. It's not fashionable. Social capital and local institutions are not seen as assets for ecosystem provision. The favorite landscape for conservation, it's an empty landscape, even if it's ideal for criminal activities, which are a problem in Mexico. There's a huge overregulation, over-centralized scheme of forest governance. All the decisions, even if the communities are so-called owners of the land, most of the decisions are taken in Mexico City, in understaffed office, by very efficient government agencies with poor capacities of monitoring and sanctioning. So the result of this is, again, open access. I mean, the cost of violating a very expensive law is close to zero. And investment on community forest production, it's still very marginal. RED, the global program of reduced emission for avoided deforestation and degradation, still makes almost exclusive emphasis on central governments as key players, strongly contributed to centralization, to government control, to enforce central government control in detriment of local rights, incentives, and livelihoods. And as I once heard somebody in Nepal, natural resources cannot be managed by remote control, even in a global world. This is my last slide. For a smooth-scale governance, it's a contested domain. From bottom-up, regional alliances have been crucial in order to regain local rights, acquire political voice, create local and technical governance capacities. Top-down relations in general between communities and national policies tend to deny local rights, re-centralize local rights in the federal central governments, and have weak accountability and social capital. I think this is very much related with the weakness of our so-called democracy. So the risks are increasing. We need innovation, multi-scale and ecosystem perspective for the analysis of appropriation and provision problems and policies, a reformulation of theory and methodology, as I said, and need for institutional innovation. Muchas gracias.
So we have time for some questions. Does anybody have a question for Leticia?
It was too complex. Or is it too late?
Please.
Maybe I have a question. My name is Tatiana. I've met already before. I'm from Slovakia. A very interesting talk you gave us. And you were talking about the trust. Of course, we understand everybody from the point. And especially coming to the scaling up is a problem. How to bring trust into the non-personal relationships. Would you be able to talk a little more about this? Are there any positive examples of it that you would like to raise?
Okay.
That would be my question.
That's a very key question. Other questions? Well, I think this is very much, or this was even for us from a work in progress. I mean, the work about trust in different levels. And you have, since 10, 15 years ago, authors like Wilkinson, who talks about bonding social capital, bridging social capital, linking social capital. That is trust among different actors, not only local, very similar actors, but trust among similar communities, let's say in the case of communities, and trust to different agents, or agents which are located in different scales, such as the market or the state. I think what I found in the readings I did for this presentation, Ostrom, De Condicio, John, it's that when you move in scales, obviously the trust, at least based on face-to-face and cheap talk, as she used to say, it's more and more scarce, because that's not possible. Our relationships tend to be more unpersonal. And I asked her, one of the last times I saw her, if she believed the communication through internet could create somehow similar knowledge and bonding among groups and people. And she told me this needed to be tested empirically, that yes and no, that she was not sure that it may, but you have to have previous personal contact. But in more general terms, I think there are two critical questions. One is inequality, as I was pointing out. I mean, in unequal societies, trust tend to be, because there's abuse, elite abuse, trust needs to be very scarce. And when there are power gaps among actors like global actors and local actors, trust, it's very quickly eroded or never happens. And the other is accountability. I think it's not the same kind of trust. This is why I pointed out that we should have to reframe the role and the types of trust. It's not the kind of trust based on personal bonding, but at least trust that the others will fulfill their commitments, pay their taxes, contribute to the missions, and so on. And here again, institutions, considered as ruling use, have a very important role. But I think the challenges are larger. But there are some insights. I think we have the research of the previous 20 years as a source of insights and guidance.
What about, for example, fear as a driver for trust? The people have a kind of negative experience. We know that a number of climate policies has been went to the US policy system after this kind of disaster. So, in for example. So, I mean, what about this?
Well, I think the disasters, what they may do, is to fasten a common vision of the importance of the problem, a shared vision of the imminence of the disaster, of the priority of the attention. I mean, a population that may not perceive scarcity of the good, talking in economic terms, or need to move, good change and may come together. But even though when there's inequality, there are problems, and I think this was very well seen in the Katrina disaster in New Orleans. It was not the case in the earthquake in Mexico City. I mean, a lot of civic movements, because the state was so paralyzed by such a big thing, that civil society, I mean, the people in the streets start doing things and saving lives, and a lot of organizations come from these periods. But I don't want to think that we need to the loss of so many lives to change our perception and reach a common goal.
Can you see, apart from the kind of questions and beginnings of some ideas that you were presenting there, towards actually
the case? Well, perhaps.
Can you see a path from where we are now to achieving a kind of...
Could you reframe the question?
I'm just wondering how we get from here to actually managing to manage the global climate effectively.
Oh dear. Well, I think there are numbers of things that's possible to do in different regions of the world. I think it's very key to work on adaptation, because it's. I mean, I was telling Victor that 2 weeks ago I was giving a talk, and I was with with a woman giving a lecture who's the Mexican representative for the IPCC, and she was telling that if you ever dream of being like Superman, in the sense of you were born in Krypton and moved to another planet. I mean, you were born in a planet and you moved to another planet with completely different conditions. Well, this is what happened to you, because the planet where you were born 50 years ago, it's not the same planet anymore in many senses. So I think there needs to be a lot of work on adaptation, For example, in the Yucatan Peninsula, which is, I mean, you have Cancun, which is rich and different from the rest of Mexico, and you have the Yucatan Peninsula with indigenous people still speaking Maya. And there was no rain this year. I mean, nobody was able to plant anything. Another thing, I mean, coffee. Coffee is the main cash crop in Mexico and Central America. It's the cash crop from the poorest people, and it will be it is already, but it will be in the coming 10 years one of the most affected crops by climate change. So I think governments and international donors need to start working on adaptation. And I think the examples here in the north are a myriad. I think one also needs to be very conscient and change rapidly perception on the need to be low carbon in the way of consuming, in the way of producing, in the way of living, and promote coalitions or associations who do that. I mean, also in a meeting a year ago on adaptation, there was a talk given by a woman who was the senior advisor of the White House in climate issues, and she was now the second person in the American Cancer Association because she wanted to study how to mobilize collective action, energy, towards a very imminent disaster. I think what we need to have is the perception of priority and short time, and Lynn insisted on that. I mean, if you see her last paper that she finished 12 years before passing, I mean, it was, we don't have time. Time is the most scarce resource. So I don't know, I think we need to work a lot on that, south and north, east and west. And the question of inequality, I mean, which is a public bath. And I think without policies that international and national policies that consider it as such, it won't be addressed, it won't be improved per se. So I think I have more questions than answers, and I hope still many years of research in front of field work. Well, thank you very much for your time and patience.